research is questioning and disagreeing. I'm Mayla Boguslav, and I study research. I ask questions such as, what is research? How do we measure its success? I live by the motto, ignorance is bliss, because when you don't know something, it's an opportunity to learn. Researchers live in the ignorance or the unknowns. They ask questions, identify areas of ignorance, lead the way to gain knowledge, and most importantly, ask the next questions about our new ignorances. Welcome to the Ignorance Podcast, where we learn about research through research questions. Let's welcome our guest researcher for today. Please introduce yourself by name only and your favorite thing to do outside of work.
Hi, my name is Paul Lerner, and I can't give you a simple answer because I think that a few years ago I might have said something different, but I was just kind of reflecting on this really quickly and feeling that everything has changed since COVID. Having teenage kids, like lots of things have changed. So it used to be something like taking my kids to the Natural History Museum to look at dinosaurs. We haven't done that for a while. I like to go on hikes. I like to read. I like to read fiction. I like to swim, and I like to watch movies, I guess. Those are some of the things I do when I'm not working.
Yeah, what do those things help you with in terms of work or other things?
I think they get me outside of my head, and they make me feel like I'm part of something larger, especially hiking. It just makes you feel small sometimes and reduces your problems to scale. It's both, obviously it's exercise, but I think beyond that, it's just kind of taking you out of the daily routine and daily life and making you ponder like larger questions. Freud writes about the oceanic feeling you get. I love that Freud wrote about this. He wrote this almost 100 years ago, and we don't exactly picture him as speaking to us in this moment, but that, looking at the coastline fills you with this sense of like expansiveness. And I kind of feel like going up in the hills and gazing down at the ocean at the sunset or something. It just that I feel that very profoundly, I think.
I agree. I love nature. I love hiking. A lot of my big decisions have been made that way. Like when I needed to figure out what grad school to go to, I went on a hike and kind of at the top was like, okay, like I can make this decision now. Speaking of questions, what questions excite you in your work? What questions are you currently pursuing?
So, yeah, a range of questions. I'm really interested in what the world looked like in different historical moments and what kind of how profoundly different the past was from the present, but also how similar it was, which I know sounds like a paradox and a contradiction, but I think in what I see my own work doing is kind of bringing to light worlds that are no longer here, past worlds and past contexts and ideas. And I like to kind of get in and out of those ideas. Like I just mentioned Freud, right? That sometimes something that was written 100 years ago or 200 years ago feels very, very alive and we feel connected to it and it makes a lot of sense, right? And other times it's really peculiar and it can be strange and eerie or something. And so I'm really interested in the familiarity and the distance to kind of things that are no longer around us.
Well, can you talk a little bit about why these questions? What do you love maybe from a personal perspective and also from a professional perspective about those questions?
Yeah, so professionally, I've been working on a bunch of people who fled from the Nazis and came to North America. And I'm interested in what this country looked like to them and in how they were often not particularly positive about this. A lot of the intellectual and, the sort of very well established people who had to flee the Nazis and come here for safety kind of looked down on American culture because we weren't as sophisticated and advanced as Europeans were, and we were kind of crass and boorish and, very much motivated by profit, is not like the pursuit of poetry and ideas and so forth. But I'm interested in how those sensibilities changed in immigration. And how they brought a very European sensibility to parts of American daily life, and then kind of what happened at that intersection. So that's the kind of stuff I've been working on in a couple of different projects that I've been doing lately. I've been working slowly, but that also gives me time to like assimilate the stuff that's going on. And so I'm not plugging away at it every day right now, but it's there always in my mind.
And personally, how does kind of thinking about the past and the present affect you personally?
I think it's really relevant in all kinds of ways. So not to get too political too quickly, but it does help think about what's going on in the world around us, in the country, in our political life. And while it doesn't really diminish the sense of crisis that I and many other people feel, it does suggest that we've been through things before and we come out of them, at least hopefully most of us, and that, life will go on in some way, right? So there is this some kind of reassuring thing. My father used to say that a lot in the last couple of years of his life, when I would get very upset about what's going on, and he would provide that like older perspective of, this too shall pass. So I find that reassuring. In my Jewish life, I feel very like a really moving sense that what I do and say is the same basic stuff that people have said for so many hundreds of years, right? Or, I mentioned my father, he passed away in September, and I'm saying Kaddish. It's so powerful that there are these rituals that exist that everyone who's connected to those traditions follows one way or another, right? But I also feel like my experience of doing it is so different from somebody who was, say, going through the morning rituals in, I don't know, 18th century Poland or, North Africa in the 19th, wherever, Jewish life existed before. So I think it's, again, that kind of duality or that sort of seeming paradox between familiarity and strangeness.
Yeah, and I'll say that the Kaddish is a mourner's prayer you say every day in Judaism.
Right.
Yeah, so how do you hope to impact the world?
So I wrestle with that question a lot, and I am hard on myself for not having a greater impact on the world, especially when the world needs so much right now. I think a lot of it comes through my teaching. I have been teaching this large general education class on fascism. Of course, some students just take it because it fits their schedule or whatever. But a higher percentage of students than usual take this class because they're interested and they're concerned. And I feel really connected to a great many of them. And I think that by putting things in historical context with them, by exploring things that have happened before, I'm helping to give them a sense of, their own power and their own possibilities. And even if I'm not doing that much to help the world at this particular moment, maybe they will. So I feel like that's how I'm impacting the world by, creating a new generation of people who are critical thinkers and critically engaged in the world around them.
Yeah, I agree. I also love teaching and the students. It also helps us learn a lot of new things, right? When they
Totally
engage with our work and our knowledge that we're imparting on them in whatever possible way, they really, I feel like, have always sharpened my ideas. I always find discussions with students, especially some that come to like office hours or really engage a little bit more, always really fruitful, and always make me think more about what's going on. And with this hope that they'll continue to do stuff in the future. Do you have examples of a student who has gone on to do something impactful?
Oh, yeah, I do. I have a student who is studying to be a psychiatrist now, who's doing an MD and a PhD in history. And I'm full of admiration for that. I mean, all due respect to psychiatrists, but a lot of them just prescribe medication and, don't take it much deeper than that, right? But a student who kind of really understands the history of medical diagnoses and, can kind of approach the doctor-patient relationship with some depth, in terms of like power dynamics and, a little bit of ethnography. I mean, so that's just one example. I have one who's written a couple of novels over the last few years, and just like an incredibly talented student, full of energy and a beautiful writer. And lots of them go on to kind of maybe more conventional paths like law school, but I feel like even so, they are taking something with them, right? I hope anyway. I have one, for example, who I had in a class a couple of years ago who had an immigrant background. Family came from Mexico, and she wanted to do immigration law. And, she was really intensely engaged in the fascism class and really worried. And this is going back to pre-Trump too, but just really worried about family members and community members. So I know she's in law school now, and I'm sure she's going to make an amazing contribution.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm still stuck on this MD PhD in history.
Right.
I thought about doing an MD PhD at one point, but it's a lot of school.
It's a lot of school.
And it always is interesting to me what PhDs people do. It's great to see that people can do lots of different types of PhDs and really be informed for their medical practices as well. So that's really exciting. I'm excited to hear more about that student at some point, right, as that continues.
You will.
Yeah, so you just told me about who you've influenced. I'd be curious who has influenced you and who are people you look up to. Because as you're saying, with past, present, and even future, I would argue, right, with students, there's really all this crosstalk between them with this paradox you keep referencing. And so I'm really curious what's kind of your past that has led you here, and who are those people?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I will name are professors that I had, and maybe that kind of explains why I imagine my contribution as inspiring students, because some professors inspired me, and there are a lot of them. Going back to my college years, I'll give two because the contrast between them is so stark, I think. So one of them was a guy named Carl Weintraub, and he was kind of a scary figure. He was very old-fashioned. He had a European accent that was difficult to pin down, but kind of like talked through his throat and smoked a pipe, and classic old academic profile. He had hid in an attic in the Netherlands during the war, although we never talked about it. It's just the stuff we'd sort of piece together. In any case, I think he saw his job as teaching young students to think carefully and to think historically. So I have this vivid memory of early in the class reading Plato, and I think it was the Apology, and he asked a question, and I raised my hand, eager young student, and he called us by our last names, Mr. Lerner, and I said, well, I think Socrates feels that, and he said, stop right there. Now start again. And I was trying to think, what have I done wrong? And so I started again. Socrates feels, and he said, are you aware of the magnitude of your error? And I know I'm making him sound like a tyrant, but there's honestly something really loving about it, even though it was scary. And then he went on to explain that Socrates is kind of the founder of Western reason, and that Socrates didn't feel, Socrates thought, right? And that I needed to think really carefully about the words I chose. And I speak a little slowly, but I choose my words really carefully because I had people who pounced on every word I used when I was in school. And I do think it creates a kind of clarity of thought. And I have still a little Carl Weintraub in my head when I write, and he reads the sentences that I write, and he asks me if certain words are really necessary, and if there isn't a better or clearer way to say things. And so he's challenging me all the time in a supportive way. It was a kind of a life-changing experience, not just for me, but for a whole cohort of us. So it was grueling, but I think we all came through this as better thinkers, more careful thinkers. And then, so another, when I was in college, in my junior year, there was a new professor who was still finishing her dissertation, and she taught a women's history class, which I was originally, I have to admit, the 16-year-old self or 17-year-old self was a bit skeptical about, because I didn't know what it was, and it didn't seem like something that was really worth my time. but it blew my mind. Her name is Leora Ausländer, and we're still in touch. She was just really brilliant, and I immediately kind of took her as a role model and wanted to be like her, and sought her out. And she had incredible patience and would just like let me sit there in her office while we talked. And I think kind of having people pay attention to me and care about what I thought and what I read and what I said. Yeah, I mean, I think those two in extremely different ways really shaped the person that I became, and kind of my approach to teaching, to being with students, to writing, and also to research.
Yeah, this thinking fast, right, or talking fast versus talking slow. I'm always told I talk really fast, and I'm trying right now in my head to slow down. And taking the time to choose your words is really important. So my PhD is in natural language processing. And what I love about language, especially from this computational side, is to me it's really this marriage between philosophy and math, right? Trying to formalize thoughts and ideas, thinking about how you should be saying something. And from my PhD, how to even then automate that or really understand that from a slightly different path. And so I love thinking about language and the importance of it. And there's so many fun play on words and all of these things. So I really connected with that. And this idea of patience, right, really being there and seeing people, I also really connect with. I think research is not just about having ideas, but it's being able to have talk between ideas and really listening to lots of people that can sharpen them in all different ways. I've been told at different points that a grant and publications are really ways to actually sharpen your ideas, that once you have to write it down, and especially then show it to people and get it reviewed and all of those things, that's really where our ideas really get sharpened and honed in on. And I would love for you to comment on that.
Well, I want to ask you more about studying natural language processing. But to answer your question, I completely agree. And that is one reason why I apply for grants, because one has all these ideas, but until you've tried to put it down in writing, the ideas are just vague and it's not clear if they're really going to amount to anything. So I try, and I tell my students this too, to put something in writing early and to revise constantly, to show to people, to get more eyes on it, to write, to put it away, and then to come back to it. So yeah, I think that every opportunity to apply for grants is really helpful for young researchers. When you're trying to write a book, it takes years, and the book that exists is just sort of thoughts in your mind and notes, and then maybe drafts when you start to come up with them. But putting it into a grant application or book proposal is kind of that's when the thing takes form, right? And then it takes on a life of its own. I mean, it's such an interesting kind of organic process, right? Where then suddenly you have chapters where you before just had ideas and thoughts and notes. And so I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I'm in that process right now. So two things I have not done yet are really writing a grant fully and writing a book. And I have different ideas for both of those. And specifically the grant one being first, I've definitely just needed lots of time going hiking and walking and all this stuff to try to let those ideas meld and think about the best way to really pitch it, right? And kind of sell it. And I think that's the other big difference with a grant is that you really have to sell the idea. It's much easier to talk about and write about what we've already done. It's much harder, at least for me, to talk about and write about what I haven't done yet. And I think it's a process in itself to really kind of start to defend your ideas and to showcase why it's really important to still do. So I like that a lot. If you have, I'm happy to answer any questions about NLP if you have one.
I mean, I'm so interested in that you're studying this, and I didn't know that's what you worked on. Is it sort of a theoretical inquiry, or is it for application for AI or something, or is it the linguistics or the psychology or the computer science, or is all of the above?
Yeah, so NLP or natural language processing, I really studied during my PhD. A lot of natural language processing focuses on knowledge, right? Trying to extract knowledge from information, be it trying to create a knowledge base like kind of Wikipedia or other things, or even generate text like OpenAI and all these systems. Those did not exist right when I was getting my PhD, but I used some of the underpinnings like large language models at large. And so what I really thought about instead, and this is kind of the influence for my podcast too, is when I got to my PhD, I realized pretty quickly to get a PhD, you have to ask a question and answer it to some extent with some novelty in there, right? And so I was like, okay, I'll just go find all the questions. Like I figured it out. Great. But that's actually a hard problem to go find all the questions, and not only finding questions that are answerable and ideally in a certain amount of time so you can actually finish your PhD. And so I went and read the literature as everyone tells you to do. I talked to people and all these things, and I didn't feel satisfied about it. I also thought about kind of my own education, thinking about, did I actually even know the questions from what I had studied, right? Did I come out prepared to ask questions in this research way? And I could tell you I studied mathematics, and so I could tell you a lot of differential equations are for physics, but I couldn't tell you exactly the problems. I couldn't tell you exactly why. And so I felt kind of failed by the educational system in some way. And so that actually became my PhD thesis, creating an ignorance base or a question base about what we don't know. So taking some of the biomedical research, specifically prenatal nutrition, and extracting all the different questions that people ask and connecting them and seeing what new ideas and new things can form based on the connections of questions, whether that's just because you want to explore them or because you want to find questions in some fields that connect to other fields so you can help answer them. So, for example, specifically in prenatal nutrition, it's actually very hard to study, right? Pregnant women are quite hard to study. And so there are some questions that are really hard to ask in that system. But maybe if they touch on questions in another field, so for example, we found this with brains. One of my examples was vitamin D that I showed this in, that if you take a bunch of vitamin D genes and other stuff like that and enter into this kind of ignorance-based space, you can actually find a lot that touch on brain development. And so now maybe you can talk to a neuroscientist about those questions and see if they've been able to answer them in their own field or how that can crosstalk at large. So that's really what I was doing with natural language processing in my PhD. Now I study the science of team science. So how do we collaborate better to do better research and have better impact? And so I'm all about questions at large in that space. And I do think language matters in that. One thing we talk about in terms of collaboration is, do we even understand each other in the words that we're using? The hardest part about language is ambiguity and variability. So if I say to you the word table, that could actually mean multiple things, right? That's ambiguous. I can also say street and road, and they generally mean the same thing, but that's the variability of the language. And so those are the two problems that make language really hard from a computational perspective. And I'm thinking in general about language as when we bring lots of disciplines together in this teaming way or collaboration way, what new language forms or what new definitions potentially form, thinking about it maybe as a measure of how new or novel or innovative a project or a team may be.
Wow. The connection between the kind of researching teams and the natural language processing was not one I would have guessed, but I can really see it now.
Yeah, and I haven't done work yet that connects all those two, because there's a lot of work kind of understanding the field of teams and collaboration. So I'm thinking a lot about the what question before I get to the how and automation questions. But I do think there's a big connection. That language for me has been a big through line throughout my research. And as we've been talking about, I'm really careful about the language I use. And a lot of my PhD has been about, and even my current research, how do I communicate these ideas that are more meta or more science of science in these ways? And so some people say to me, I research researchers. And that's exactly what I love to do. I love to think about research in these ways. And that's what started this podcast at large, are a lot of these ideas. And so my next question for you, thinking about researching researchers, is how do you know if you've been successful at your work and as a researcher? What is your evaluation criteria?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It depends what you mean by success. Because I'm in a humanities or humanistic social science discipline, the criteria are maybe a bit different. We are trying to answer questions, right? And I think that is something that probably runs through all research, no matter what field you're in. But we're trying to produce these products that are on one level not complete or finished because it's part of an ongoing process, right? So something I did 5 years ago feels very inadequate to me today, and which is a good thing, and that makes me feel good about the process. On the other hand, there's almost an artistic element, right? Because for a book or an academic article in my field to be finished, it has to be beautiful in a way. I know that sounds absurd, but it has to be kind of whole. So you can sort of go into archives and read primary sources and find truths and interesting things that push knowledge further. But for the work itself to be complete, I think that information or that knowledge gain has to be incorporated into some larger contribution which has an elegance to it or something. And I'm sure not all historians see it that way. One reason I write slowly is because I'm so obsessed with how a work holds together, and it's hard for me to let go of something because it can always use another draft.
So how do you know it's complete?
So sometimes it's because of external pressure. If I have a deadline, then I just do as much as I can up to the last minute, knowing that there will probably be comments from a referee or some external person who will have feedback. So in a way, nothing is ever completely done until it's published. And even then, it's not completely done because you'll write something else about the same topic at some point. But I do think there's more to that answer, which is you kind of just know it. There is a feeling that this is done now. Everything I do from now on is only going to make it worse.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question I think about too in terms of my work. And I'm not necessarily writing books. More of my publishing is papers. But the research angle is that you can always do more. We even write sections about our future work. What's the next steps? Basically, this idea of when to be complete in the work feels sometimes anti-research. But if we're never done, that's also not great, right? We always need to also get it out. Sometimes for me, I'm over the work is another reason I'm done with it. And as you said, we submit and then we get it back with feedback and comments. I feel like I can start that process and know that I can continue it. And even more so, following up on it, that even once that paper is published or that book is published, in your case, I can then write more things later. And so it's never finished. And I think that's the beauty. And that's why I love ignorance is bliss, because we as researchers really play on that ignorance or that or those unknowns at large. And we wouldn't have jobs if we knew everything or didn't have more to say about all these different questions. So I really love that.
I've never talked about this with anyone else, but I feel like it's a little secret of my own that, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. You can only really finish a project when you lose interest in it, because as long as you're interested in it, there's just more to learn. And then eventually I'll just think, okay, enough already. I just have to write this damn thing. I can't keep reading and keep going back into archives.
Yes. And I'll add, some people say, write what you know, but I've also heard, especially on Adam Grant's podcast, write what you want to learn. Because when we're eager to learn, it will continue, right? It keeps and piques your interest. And that's why I love questions, because it really is about the curiosity for us at large. So with that, I'm curious, what has been your most surprising result?
I mean, I have, let's see. All right, you know what? This is how I'm going to answer your question, because this, I think, gives you a sense of how almost haphazard the kind of research I do is, because it really depends on the availability of material, and material becomes available in serendipitous ways. So there was a figure that I knew existed and had lived, someone who worked as a psychiatrist And I'd come across his name as someone who'd given some lectures and taught at USC. And as I think is clear by now, one of the things that I study is history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, among other things. And so I knew about him. His name is Friedrich Hacker, who's born in Vienna and ended up in LA and went back and forth between LA and Germany and Austria in the last decades of his life. And this is the population of people that I've been studying for the last years. So I always had kind of in the back of my mind, find out more about Hacker, do more about Hacker, right? Because here is this figure who fits into these larger international trends, who was, at least I didn't really know it yet, but in conversation with lots of really well-known people who I do study and others study. But he was here, so that's kind of like a local connection. So go back a few years to mid to late COVID. I hear from some librarians I work with that the Hacker family has some material in a garage that they are willing to donate to USC libraries and archives. And could I come take a look with a couple of librarians and decide if there's anything worthwhile in this material or if they should just destroy it?
Oh, so that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I then met Hacker's nephew, Michael Hacker, who is based in LA and gotten to know since. And Michael was explaining that they were selling the house and there's all this junk and all this old stuff. Would it be interesting to us? So I start looking through these folders, which are just basically sitting there in the garage gathering dust. And back in those days, and I'm talking about really the 1930s, 40s, 50s, people wrote letters all the time. That kind of managing the correspondence was a big part of one's regular life, both professionally and personally, right? So the people I study all have correspondences, and they're writing to their colleagues, their friends, and friends and colleagues are often the same people. And I start to look and I see that Hacker had a correspondence with all kinds of really interesting and really important people, including Bruno Kreisky, who was the Chancellor of Austria, Kurt Waldheim, who was the president of Austria, who's most famous because he had been a Nazi and involved in some really terrible things during that period, and then later became the Secretary General of the UN and the president of Austria before his past was fully unearthed and verified. So he had a correspondence with Waldheim. And all these really interesting psychologists, psychoanalysts, Carl Menninger, who really key figure in post-war American psychiatry, a bunch of Anna Freud. So I'm going through this stuff and I cannot believe it, right? Because here's this guy who I've just barely heard of, and he's got extensive correspondence with all of these fascinating people. Letter from Thomas Mann, anybody who's anybody in the kind of German-speaking world, especially in the world of the people who emigrated, who had to leave Nazi Europe. We decided we want to take the stuff to the libraries, and things were slow for COVID, but it took maybe a year or two, but eventually everything got cataloged. And a couple summers ago, I spent a bunch of days up in the library kind of going through and making a note of all these letters and taking pictures of everything that looked interesting. And so in terms of surprises, that there's this figure who, again, it was just a name to me. Nobody I've asked has ever heard of him unless they happen to have a reason, right? Which is only a handful of people. But in addition to his correspondence with all these important intellectuals, he had two offices in LA. One of them was in Beverly Hills and one of them was south of downtown. The one in Beverly Hills was a place where a lot of movie stars came to get psychoanalytic treatment. So I'm finding this stuff also about some really famous patients, and he had interesting relationships with some of them. And he had a correspondence with for example, the analyst who treated Marilyn Monroe, and he treated Hedy Lamarr. And so it's also this glimpse into old Hollywood and this kind of moment that I'm fascinated with, where certainly the writers in Hollywood, but also directors and actors, all were getting psychoanalytic treatment. And the analysts tended to be these European Jewish emigres. So this kind of intersection of that population with the most glamorous Hollywood stars, right, is so fascinating to me. So I guess that's my surprise, that a person who's the most obscure famous person or most forgotten person or something. So I'm still collecting material about him and doing probably eventually a whole project on him, just because he's so interesting. Although I have to say he's not the most sophisticated thinker, but he had correspondence with many who were, and he helped them out a lot and brought some of them to speak at USC or at the Hacker Foundation. And this whole other piece is that he was a specialist in the psychology of terror and fear, and wrote a couple of books about it, and was a consultant for cases of hostage situations and kidnappings. So when Patty Hearst was kidnapped, the family hired him to negotiate to try to get her released. He wasn't involved in the 1972 Munich Olympics attack, but afterwards the German government brought him to Munich and had him kind of look at things and talk to them about how they could avoid this from happening again. But then what's really interesting to me is in 1973, if Jews wanted to leave the Soviet Union, who were allowed to leave the Soviet Union in those years, generally went to Austria first because it was neutral, or they went Soviet Union to East Berlin, to Vienna, to West Berlin, and then usually through Italy to Israel or the United States, or occasionally other places too. And for a period there, they would stay at a temporary camp outside of Vienna. And in 1973, 3 of them were taken hostage by Palestinians. And this is an event I had never heard of until I started reading about Hacker. And the chancellor at the time, Bruno Kreisky, was Hacker's old friend, and Kreisky brought Hacker in to negotiate. And so he negotiated the release of these 3 Russian Jews who were headed to Israel. Basically, they promised the Palestinian, I guess it was the PLO, promised them that Austria wouldn't take any more Jews on their way to Israel, although it wasn't a promise they kept. But Hacker was then blamed for giving the Palestinians everything they wanted, and Golda Meir flew in to yell at Kreisky and Hacker for being self-hating Jews. And so anyway, he just has this way of being in the eye of the storm, right? It's like this figure who there's something important and interesting going on, and of course he's there. He's involved in it, right? And the last thing I'll say about him for now is that he died while on live TV in West Germany. So he went out, very dramatically, like he did everything.
Wow, I look forward to reading that book. I think that's where I'll leave it. Wow, that is surprising and fascinating and all of the things. My next question is kind of the other side of this coin of what is your favorite disagreement?
Yeah, that's a good one. Disagreements are a great thing in my field, right? And in a way, this is how we do graduate courses and graduate teaching, right? What are the key disagreements? And I'll pull on one that comes out of my teaching more than the research I've been doing lately, which is about how to define fascism. So there are several historians, very influential historians, who argue that fascism was specific to Europe between World War I and World War II, that it came about from the war trauma of World War I and the effect of this incredibly destructive war on society, on civilian life, on new democracies that came out of the war, and that it was also a response to economic crisis at the end of the 1920s. And that this particular combination of things, the response to crisis, the hyper-nationalism, the kind of reassertion of traditional gender roles. So many, there's a kind of litany of characteristics of fascism, and that they all were unique to that particular moment. And then there are other historians who say, absolutely not, that fascism is a global phenomenon, and it certainly got its start in Italy in that period. But almost as soon as it started, there were fascist movements, not only throughout Europe, but in places like Chile, Japan, India. And it was from the beginning a global phenomenon, and it didn't end with the end of World War II. That we see fascism again in all kinds of movements after World War II, including today around us. And I think it's a really fascinating debate. I've sort of, I think some historians, I used to think the first thing and then I started to think the second thing. But it's a productive debate because it really gets you to kind of think about what is this concept and how important is historical context, and is it still this thing if it happens in a different time and place? And so that's just one example of, I think, a constructive disagreement.
Yeah, I love this question, both surprises and disagreements, because I think this is how we move our science forward. And this is how we continue asking those questions in different ways and sharpening our ideas, as you mentioned, with your disagreements. Last question, and then I'll let you introduce yourself. If you could do anything, not limited by grants or other factors in your space, what would you be doing? What is your vision for the world?
For the world or for my own life?
Or you can both.
Say both. All right, I'm going to give you both. Very greedily and selfishly, I want to just sort of have really interested students and a small group of them and read books with them and just talk about books, about big questions and concepts, and not have to give exams and not have to check attendance and not have, right? I just, and whether it's undergrads or graduate students, it kind of doesn't really matter. I think my kind of fantasy is being at a place like All Souls College in Oxford or Institute for Advanced Study, where there's time to think and not have to worry about, I have to write these memos today, to answer 73 emails. So I think just sort of time to go deeply into interesting books that engage with really complicated, complex, important questions. That's the fantasy about time and space. And then I think about the world. I mean, I guess I don't know how I fit into this, but I just wish there were a world that that a kind of like basic human decency were, like of a shared value, and that we could agree to give each other the benefit of the doubt, but, maybe more profoundly than that, just to sort of accept people and not demonize them. And I realize what I'm saying could be taken in different ways, and that's okay. But I think that there's just something about the culture we're in, fueled by the technologies we have that we use for exchanging thoughts and ideas. I think that it lends itself to caricatures, to demonization, and that we just can't be grown-ups, and be decent. So I just imagine a world where that activity of sitting around a table with a bunch of students and really pushing our brain, making our brains hurt with trying to understand what somebody meant in some obscure text. I know we can't do that as a country or as a world, but if we could even get one step closer to doing that, I think that it would be a better place.
Yeah, I agree. It's a beautiful vision. Part of what I am doing with this podcast too is thinking about how do we communicate science? How do we rebuild our trust in research and science at large? And I think through showcasing what we really do in terms of these questions and curiosities, my hope is to push that and help get to a world where we can really focus on questions. Human decency is really important. And part of the goal of this podcast, right, is to think about how we can communicate science honestly and transparently and accessibly to people, and not just science, but also research at large, and really open conversations and focus on conversations using questions. That my theory at large of how I live my life is this idea, again, right, of ignorance is bliss, but really that questions are opening and inviting and allow us to really have conversations in this decent way. And so I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Please say your name, your job title, and your field, and anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. So my name is Paul Lerner. I'm a professor of history at University of Southern California, which I think was probably already made clear. And I primarily focused on German history and modern European history when I was in graduate school. And I've kind of broadened that a little bit over time to work on modern Jewish history, but particularly on history of human science, history of the psi disciplines and social sciences. And I'm interested in how scientific ideas change over time, but in particular how those changes are tied into social and cultural and other historical factors. But, when you were talking about the kind of thinking behind the podcast, and I've always had this interest in history of science, maybe because of my failed attempt to become a scientist myself, which we don't need to go into. We read Foucault and Bruno Latour and these sort of very critical reflections on scientific power, on medicine. Thomas Kuhn, who's not especially critical, but still challenges us to think about the change in scientific ideas and what makes one hypothesis or theory take the place of another one. How does scientific knowledge change and move? I was in a world where there was a luxury to think really critically about science and to see science as sort of conspiratorial, maybe some vestiges of the Cold War, or even kind of just thinking about science as a way of states and societies exercising power over people, going back to 19th century asylums in my field of history of psychiatry, and kind of through, really abusive treatments in the 20th century, like lobotomies. But nevertheless, I was teaching this history of psychiatry class again some years ago in the first Trump administration. And early in the class, I started to kind of present this notion of science as kind of system of power and so forth. And I noticed the students were really uneasy. And these were honor students, very serious students. And I kind of eventually realized that they were hearing me from a place where science was being attacked, and they were kind of assuming that I was attacking the validity of scientific knowledge. And if we fast forward to where we are today, where things like vaccines and public health, ideas that have been, really pretty rock solid for quite a while, right? Where all this is being called into question, we're sort of teaching, basic, well-established scientific understanding of natural history is, I assume, going to be challenged soon too, or already is being challenged. So, seen in that way, I think you really have to be much more nuanced when you start to introduce critical perspectives to science studies, right? And say, look, I'm a fan of science. Don't get me wrong, right? I just think we need to, have our eyes open. As sort of a science studies adjacent scholar, I think that I'm really a big fan of your attempt here to think about research, to even in a meta way, kind of put it front and center and engage in these wide-ranging conversations. So it's been really fun, and I'm really excited about what you're up to.
My biggest takeaway is the importance of choosing your words carefully. Do we all need a Carl Weintraub in our heads as somebody to help us deeply think about our words? I deeply thought about my podcast questions and wanted them to work for any researcher, but I wasn't sure. This episode was me testing this theory with a social scientist, and it worked. Putting our ideas, thoughts, and language into the world helps us sharpen them. What ideas, thoughts, questions, or language do you want to put out into the world? This podcast is hosted by me, Mayla Boguslav, and produced and edited by Joshua Mendel. To learn more about this episode's guest and any cited or named people, take a look at the episode description. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ignorance Podcast. Please follow the Ignorance Podcast wherever you get your podcasts to learn about science through research questions.